Thanks very much for the invitation to speak at the symposium. It's always a bit weird just talking to my screen here. It's hard to know who's out there, but hello to all of you, and thanks for being here. I'll talk to you today about some work we've been doing over the past, decade or more, trying to come up with methods and techniques to explore how the brain responds to natural and complex time-varying stimuli like speech and music and video and the kinds of things that we actually experience in real life. And we do some fMRI as well, but we focus mostly on doing this with EEG, and so that's what I'll talk about today. So just to kind of introduce the topic overall, how do people typically, over the last, 50, 60 years, how have they typically explored how the human brain responds to different types of stimuli? It's a substantial challenge because, as we all know, those of us who've used EEG, it's a complex signal that's a mix of all sorts of processes that are going on simultaneously in the brain, and they're all being, smushed and merged together and smeared across the scalp in some complicated way. So trying to understand, trying to find the signatures of processing of a stimulus against all of that background EEG is a bit like finding a needle in a haystack sometimes. And so the traditional approach for doing this over the past, as I say, 50, 60 years has been to kind of simplify the problem a little bit by making the stimuli a little bit more straightforward. Typically, if you wanted to study auditory processing, for example, you would often restrict yourself to using beeps and clicks and chirps. If you wanted to study visual processing, you might flash up a checkerboard on a screen or maybe a face or something like that. And people are, clever, so even kind of restricting themselves to a limited set of kind of very short punctate kind of stimuli like that, people have been very clever in coming up with interesting paradigms to explore sensory and perceptual processing and how cognition and clinical disorders affect that processing. But I think it's fair to say that restricting ourselves to beeps and clicks and checkerboards, etc., while useful and still very useful, is not, going to enable us to fully understand how our brains process the kinds of things we see and experience in everyday life. And so my lab has focused quite a lot on trying to, like I say, come up with methods that will loosen the constraints a little bit and allow us to explore how EEG reflects the processing of more kind of continuous and complex and naturalistic type stimuli. And so the way we've been doing this is really pretty straightforward. We've been using a technique that we and others have called a temporal response function framework to study this. So to give kind of an example of how this works, it's really just a system identification approach where we imagine that the brain is a bit of a black box and that we're sending some complicated input signal in to that black box. This signal here on the right in blue is a short little segment of speech. And we record the EEG while somebody is listening to that speech. And the question, like I say then, is what's going on in the black box of the brain that converts this input X into these, for example, 128 electrodes of Y that you've recorded. So can we, in fact, describe a mathematical mapping that explains how some feature of this X turns into these different Ys? The feature I'm going to talk about a little bit at the beginning of the talk is just the speech envelope you can see in red here. So how does this red signal turn into each of these black signals? Can we model it? One very simple way to model it is just to model it as a linear filter, a linear convolution. Can we derive a linear filter in the middle that describes how this red signal turns into each one of these black signals? And so you'll end up with 128 different temporal response functions, one for each channel, that in some optimal sense describes how the red line turns into each of the black lines. And so we do this with a linear filter, and what happens is it turns out that it looks quite like a kind of a classic event-related response, event-related potential in EEG, which makes sense. It's kind of like an impulse response function instead of an impulse response. So it looks very similar to an ERP. It has its peaks and troughs. It's distributed on the head in some way that you can try to interpret as an auditory signal. You can even use techniques from the ERP community like source analysis, to try to estimate where in the brain these temporal response functions might be deriving from. And so, it's a nice framework in that sense that it gives us measures that are familiar, that we can use the full ERP toolkit to analyze and run statistics on. But we can now do it using continuous, more complex real-world stimuli rather than carefully controlled stimuli like beeps and chirps, etc. We characterize this in some early papers, just showing how it was similar to an ERP, but not quite the same, for kind of, a variety of reasons. Importantly, you can also, as well as looking at the temporal response function itself in the middle and looking at the peaks and the troughs and the amplitudes and the latencies and all the stuff that we do with ERPs, another approach that that we have used quite a lot and lots of labs use, which has proven very powerful, is to use this framework as a so-called forward encoding model. And so the idea here is, if you have a hypothesis about how the brain might represent a complex stimulus, does it convert a complex stimulus, for example, into different representations at different hierarchical levels of the brain, for example? So if we take speech, speech at its core, speech is just me making a whole bunch of acoustic sounds out of my mouth, pops and whistles and hissing noises and ah sounds and e sounds and so on. But the human brain has evolved to quickly convert those acoustic noises into linguistic units like syllables and words and actually extract meaning from it. So somewhere in the brain then, we must be processing the acoustics of this sound, but also then maybe converting those sounds into specific representations like words and meaning that actually are relevant to us as human beings. So we can test these ideas by representing the speech in different ways. For example, I'm just using speech as an example here. We do a lot of work on speech, but this framework could apply to motion in a movie scene, faces in a scene, kind of any time varying feature of a stimulus that you're interested in and that you've recorded data for. So here, in this forward encoding framework, rather than focusing on the temporal response function parameters themselves, what one can do is one can represent the speech in different ways and then fit a temporal response function using, say, 90% of your data, and then try to predict the EEG data for the left out 10% of your experiment using that temporal response function. And if your temporal response function does a good job, if you can significantly predict responses to new stimuli, then that means that your EEG really is perhaps reflecting some of the features that you've coded into your model. I'll give you some examples of this in a short while just to make it more concrete. But the idea here is, if I've got some temporal response function, I can pass a new stimulus through it to predict what the EEG should look like. And now I have a new dependent measure. The accuracy with which I can predict the EEG represents a dependent measure that tells me something about what the brain might be computing or representing in terms of a stimulus. You can see that, again, for a speech signal, in this example, it tends to be over kind of temporal, fronto-central temporal areas, indicative of activity coming from auditory cortex. Another approach that we've been using that can be very powerful, in fact, in some ways it's more powerful, although it comes with its own limitations, is to use the whole framework in reverse, to use it as a so-called decoding model. And this is a very similar idea. The idea is, again, you've played some stimulus at a subject and you've recorded some data. But the question now that we ask is in the opposite direction. Specifically, given some data that I've recorded during an experiment, can I say something from those data about what subject actually was presented with? Can I decode something about the stimulus from the data that we recorded? Now, this has a distinct advantage, and the big advantage comes from, you'll recall in the previous couple of slides, I was explaining how this red line, for example, might turn into each one of these black lines. So that essentially is 128 separate analyses. How does this red line turn into that black one? How does that, and then a separate analysis. How does this red one turn into that black one? How does this red one turn into that black one? Etc. When you do it in the backwards direction, when you say, given all of my data at the same time, can I say something about the stimulus that caused those data? You get to use all 128 or whatever number of channels you have in one simultaneous analysis, which multivariate analysis, which is much more powerful. So you can optimally weight the different channels at different time lags to reconstruct an estimate of some feature of your stimulus. Again, I'm just using the envelope of the speech here as an example. We can reconstruct an example, our best estimate of the speech envelope. And then again, our dependent measure is how accurately we've done in reconstructing the envelope of the stimulus. We can take that reconstruction, compare it to the real stimulus envelope, and see how well we did. You can also use the weights that are applied to different channels and time lags also as dependent measures. So again, we get two dependent measures, the accuracy of our reconstruction, and then the weights and time lags of the model itself, which can be very informative. So the advantage of this decoding approach versus the encoding approach for predictions is, again, that you get to use all the data at the same time. So it's what we call a multivariate analysis and has a lot of increased sensitivity and power as a result of that. The disadvantage is that it can be difficult to reconstruct certain kind of features of a stimulus that you might be interested in, or it's not so straightforward to reconstruct them using a kind of a linear analysis like this. I'll show some examples now to give you some sense of that. Okay, so given this framework now, we felt, in the early years of using it, we were excited because it allowed us to start running some experiments that were very difficult to run using traditional beeps and clicks and chirps and so on. One particular experiment we were interested in is what's known as the cocktail party problem. This is where, unfortunately, we're doing all this in a virtual world these days, but, in more normal times, we might be having a discussion like this at an in-person meeting where there's a coffee break at the end and we all get to intermingle in a room and chat. And so we're all solving the cocktail party problem then by paying attention to our conversational partner while ignoring the conversations that are going on around us. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. It's very important to humans as social animals, but it's also very difficult to study if you're doing experiments that have only beeps and clicks going on, because it's not very representative of what it's like to be at one of these so-called cocktail parties. Now, though, that we were able to extract useful measures from EEG responses to continuous stimuli like speech, we did an experiment, a couple of experiments where we played stories to subjects simultaneously. So these were audiobooks that we played two at a time to a subject, and we asked them to pay attention to one and ignore the other. So, again, it's a little artificial. These are audiobooks, not conversations, but it was much closer to a real life scenario than what we had been doing in the past. And it turns out that people are really good at this. So if you ask them to pay attention, for the first few seconds, it sounds a little bit weird. They're getting hit with two stories. But, again, we've evolved to do this. And so within a few seconds, they're totally engaged in the story that you've asked them to pay attention to. They can answer a whole bunch of questions on it very accurately. And they've no idea what's going on in the unattended question down the bottom here. They're scoring at chance level in multiple choice questions on the unattended story. They're just not able to absorb it. And what we see then in the temporal response functions, the functions themselves as dependent measures, is we see interesting differences in the responses, suggesting that attention works kind of later in the system. And I won't get into the kind of psychological history of cocktail party attention, but just to say, we notice interesting kind of attentional effects on particular weights and locations in the temporal response function that were really quite informative in terms of how attention to speech might operate in these environments. And so this was a really nice result for us in the early days, because it allowed us to examine a question using these naturalistic stimuli that was very difficult to do with our previous setup. And then to give you a sense of the idea of going in this forward direction and looking at the temporal response function versus going in the backward direction, doing some decoding. A couple of years later, we decided to go and revisit this exact same data set. Now, just to give you a sense of it, this pretty looking responses here, to get responses like this did require quite a bit of data. We had each subject listen to half an hour of these stories, and we actually had 40 subjects take part in this experiment, and we got these lovely responses. But that's quite a lot of data, 40 subjects and half an hour each. What we wondered then was, would it be possible with the same data to actually decode who somebody was paying attention to almost in real time? And honestly, when we started this project, I was not hopeful. I did not think it would work. But because, like I say, we had taken 40 subjects and 30 minutes of data to see the effects going in the forward direction. What happened now is, again, we used this framework that I mentioned a minute ago. We took all 128 channels. We tried to reconstruct an estimate of the speech envelope that the person heard. And then we compared that speech envelope reconstruction to either the the envelope of the attended story or the unattended story. Don't forget they're hearing two stories at the same time. So if we try and reconstruct the speech envelope from the data, does it look more like the attended story or the unattended story? And we could do this in each trial. Each of our trials was about a minute long. So after 1 minute of data, can we tell something about who you're paying attention to? And it turns out it works really quite well. So for some subjects, we were able to decode their attention with 100% accuracy. Some subjects a little lower. That might reflect just noise in the data, or it might reflect that the person was not actually paying attention 100% of the time. It's not quite clear. And so we were able to actually decode. So this highlights the sensitivity of this decoding approach and taking all channels at the same time. We can really get very clear and strong results in individual subjects in a short period of time. Okay, so that gives a sense of the overall framework, and just using this speech and cocktail party as an example. But one other important aspect that we've spent a lot of time on in recent years is all of the work that I've talked about so far is based on representing a speech signal as a speech envelope, which is really a very poor measure of a speech signal. Speech is very rich in intonation, syllables, words, meaning, and to reduce all of that down to just the amplitude of the signal is to throw away a lot of useful information. So what we have spent time on in recent years is trying to see, is the EEG sensitive, using this framework, to these other aspects of speech, not just the sounds that I'm making, but also what those words mean, where the syllables and phonemes and different sounds in the speech actually are. And so we've done quite a bit of that. Oh yeah, I'm going to skip over this. We've also been using this framework to explore videos and audio-visual speech and things like that with good effect. So it doesn't have to be speech. It can also be videos, music. We've also been using it. But just to move on to this notion that when a brain is responding to a stimulus, a real-world stimulus, it's doing so at multiple levels of the hierarchy, so to speak. My brain responds to the sounds of speech, but also to the little speech units like syllables and phonemes, and also to the meaning of the words. And so to do that, to explore this in the first instance, we use this forward encoding framework that I mentioned before. We took the speech and represented it in different ways. We represented it as its envelope, which we had done before. It's a fuller representation of its acoustics, kind of a fuller spectrogram. And then we also represented it as what are known as its phonemes. These are the little units of speech that change the word, say, from bag to bug. That little sound in the middle changes the meaning of the word. It's a little phoneme. And what's interesting about phonemes, is that I might say the phoneme in different ways, in different contexts. But you, as a human listener, converts those sounds into those kind of almost digital representations. In order to understand speech, you need to kind of convert that variable acoustic signal into some kind of linguistic units. So again, the idea here was to fit the temporal response function to these different representations and see, could we predict EEG data from left-out trials in order to test this hypothesis. And so the idea was that, so the result was that, we could predict EEG significantly with a whole bunch of different speech representations. But what worked best was when we took a speech representation that combined the acoustics of the speech with these phoneme representations that kind of, that we hypothesized that humans are actually using to convert speech into meaning. And so that worked really well. It didn't work for backward speech, but it's just, again, I'm just trying to showcase a way that we can test hypotheses about how brains represent information at different levels by building models that incorporate those levels and then trying to predict data and seeing if the accuracy of the predictions changes as a way to test them. Now, I'll jump forward quite quickly to one last, more recent piece. Of course, when we listen to speech, we're mostly interested in understanding the meaning of the words. And can we model that using this framework in EEG? And so, yes, the answer is that we can. The way we've been doing that recently is by leveraging the kind of progress in machine learning to quantify the meaning of words. So we all know that Siri and Alexa and these things are doing so well at speech recognition these days. They all work on numbers. Obviously, they're computer-based systems. So you can actually pull numbers out of those machine learning systems to quantify the meaning of words in some sense. So we did that, and we found that we could
turn up the lavalier.
Hello?
There in 10, yeah. Thank you. I got it. Okay.
Okay. I'll try and just keep going. I'm almost finished. We can model the meaning of words quantitatively using some machine learning systems. And it produces these vectors of numbers that we can then try to relate to the EEG using our same system. Can we take these vectors and predict EEG or model the EEG responses to the meaning of the words using this kind of forward encoding modeling framework? And it turns out we can, and we get these really strong responses when somebody's understanding the meaning of the speech that they're hearing. When they're not understanding it, we played it backwards, for example, we get no response. These are really strong differences in EEG. It's not just a matter of, we almost didn't have to run any stats on this at all. There's a huge response when you're understanding and no response when you can't understand at all. These are not acoustic responses anymore. They're cognitive responses to the meaning of the words. We also show, again, I'll just jump forward, in a cocktail party scenario, you get very strong responses to the story you're paying attention to and no response at all to the unattended story because you're not understanding the meaning of the words. So this is, again, just to show that you can model EEG responses to natural stimuli at different levels like this, forward and backward, with different results and insights. So to summarize, EEG can be modeled, EEG responses to natural stimuli can be modeled based on dynamic features of those stimuli. The models themselves can be used as dependent measures. You can also use it to predict EEG or backwards model, decode from the EEG to the stimulus, give you different dependent measures. And we've been studying it to look at cocktail party attention and then the modeling of speech at different hierarchical levels, including the understanding of speech. And then finally, just to say that if folks are interested in that, we have a toolbox that makes this as easy as possible to do. And we have a couple of companion papers to go with that toolbox.